And of course, part of our discussion or part of our time is to hear, not just only from you to hear from us, but us to hear from you, including those who are actively engaged in theological training now as students or recent alumni and working together. So we're going to have a panel or a discussion with three persons from the three different, two of the three partners here. One of the questions that I would like to ask us, all of us, you are the us, is to reflect about the first time, first encounter, first time you realized women were in leadership, first time you visualized or saw women in leadership. What was your first experience and what was your first response? For some of us, we have grown up with women pastors. For others of us, maybe like the first time when you go, whoa, that could be me. Right? So, go ahead. Tell us who you are also. Michelle, do you want to start?
My name is Michelle Hodge, and I am a first-year MA in Historical Theology student here at Wheaton. Thank you for your time and for the invitation to come and speak at this first conference. It is a true honor to be here. My essay that I wrote out for this panel is slightly different than my first encounter with women in leadership, but it was instead, this essay is a reflection of my first encounter of the Blessed Virgin. So if you will allow for me to read this essay as a response to the question raised. So I will begin. For 7 years, I served at one of many Southern Baptist churches in rural East Texas. There was no building, but church took place in traditions, a conference room located on the second floor of the nearby University Student Center. The church functioned off the campus calendar, gathering there every week unless otherwise closed for break. In those weeks, we met at an elementary school cafeteria that was no longer in use. Everything we needed fit in a 6x12 enclosed trailer, and part of the setup meant hauling hand trucks of sound equipment to the upstairs room an hour before worship began. Rearranging banquet room chairs and placing music stands provided the necessary distraction from the ever-growing dissonance between the church and me. It was a misdirected liturgy that carried me from one week to the next, because someone would need to untangle the microphone cords again. Worship felt less like entering a divine mystery and more like showing up for Tuesday work without the benefits of hourly pay. Faith turned grayscale, lacking inner depth, beauty, and contrast. This dulled state led to a chronic spiritual fatigue with the occasional onset of outright disbelief. What I missed were the subliminal reminders that the space I entered was sacred, that this moment was different from the rest, that it was indeed Sunday. Space and the way that we inhabit it matters deeply. We are embodied beings who not only hear, but see, taste, and smell. This is what fed part of my spiritual fatigue, that I longed for what was not observable to the senses. I longed for beauty where she was most absent. The first encounter took place 2 Decembers ago in a cramped apartment with thrifted furniture, a record player, and a kitchen table dotted with Honey Nut Cheerios that the 2-year-old had abandoned mid-snack. I spent most evenings at this quaint apartment with my dear friend Danielle, her husband, and their 2 kids. I was still a part of the Baptist church at that time, though on my way out. This was the very church where we had first met as college students several years ago. And now they were on a journey out of Protestantism and into Orthodoxy, stopping in the Episcopal Church along the way. That December, Danielle gifted me with the most valuable possession that I have ever received, a wooden icon of the Theotokos. I had no words to say other than a muddled thank you. For in that moment, she had revealed to me that it was Mary that I longed to see, and that nothing would ever be the same. Beauty became visible as I beheld her for the first time. What followed the wonder and awe was uneasiness and despair as I dared to ask if the church I knew and at one time loved was wrong about Mary, that she was indeed the Theotokos, demanding not only our reverence, but our love. And to answer this question meant heading north, because remember, I'm in East Texas at this point, where 2 churches exist, Southern and Baptist, neither of which are friendly towards Mary or women. Mary made her one-time appearance on Christmas Eve with the reading of the birth narrative in Luke, otherwise remaining absent within the worship space. With time, I grew dull-eyed and disillusioned by what the church preached and affirmed until I could no longer worship in peace. And this saddened me deeply, but I imagine that these labor pains are a normal part of the Christian life. Leaving East Texas was both an exile and an exodus, a forced departure and a longing for the promised land. But unlike the exile, there was no hope of return. Moving to Wheaton means that the first encounters take place weekly or sometimes daily now. And this is what I came here for. Just the other week, our graduate class on women in history and theology worked through the Proto-Evangelium of James. For all but one of us, this was our first reading of the birth account. And perhaps unsurprisingly, each of us responded with a captivated love for the Proto-Evangelium, the retelling of the birth narrative, this time with Mary at its center. As the story reads, in the 9th month, Anna gave birth, and she said to the midwife, "What have I brought forth?" And she said, "A female." And Anna said, "My soul is magnified this day." And she lay her down. And when the days were completed, Anna purified herself and gave suck to the child and called her Mary. Anna responded with praise, a proto-magnificat that her daughter would fulfill in time. What matters is not whether the account is true, but whether we let the beauty speak for itself. What matters is whether we lean in closely and listen so as not to miss what is said. Most days begin with an ordinary ritual, a morning coffee. While the French press brews, I light the beeswax candle in front of the icon. Her presence brings a joyous radiance to the otherwise darkened Midwestern morning. I alert the cat that it is time to pray, and she reluctantly joins me in the bedroom, stopping to stretch along the way. And she usually makes it there by the Venite, just shy of the confession. And together, we pray. Now the cat occasionally bumps her head against the coffee mug just hard enough that the hot liquid drips down my hand and onto the pages beneath. And I sigh. as I look up at the icon before me. But something looks different now than it did on the first encounter. For that December evening, what I witnessed was an image that vindicated the ongoing silent protest against her absence. But what I missed was the story being told. What I missed was the arm of the child clinging to Mary's neck, their cheeks touching in a warm embrace. What I missed was that while the infant turns his gaze upwards to his mother, she does not return the same. She looks outwards, her eyes meeting ours. What I missed was the sight of a mother's love, a love so deep that it endured to the foot of the cross, where this time she was the one with her head tilted up, looking at her son. And their eyes met, as the Gospel of St. John tells us. The icon looks different precisely because the image is no longer the end, but an invitation to enter the historic reality of the incarnation and stay there for a while. A reality that could not possibly exist without the Theotokos. It was precisely through her virginity, by the power of the Holy Spirit, that Jesus entered into humanity. The Proto-Evangelium goes on to record that unlike the previous birth account, the infant immediately took to his mother's breast because Mary had remained pure. This Sunday, I will return to All Souls Anglican Church, where an icon of the Blessed Virgin hangs on the north wall, a standing invitation to enter with joy. And I will see, and I will hear, and I will taste the love of Christ as the minister guides the chalice to my mouth and recites the blood of Christ, the cup of salvation. And I will give thanks, for that alone is enough for today. What I have entered is only the prolegomenon of the Christian story being retold, one where beauty is invites the listener to stay. I am not sure if the first encounter ever ended. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's beautiful. So my first encounter of...
Who are you?
Oh, hi, I'm Shala. Nice to meet you. I am in the Women in Theology program at Northern Seminary. And so my first encounter of women in leadership, it's kind of a mixed bag. So early, my mom's Catholic, so there was an early time of being in the Catholic Church. So there were no, female priests there. But then I went to a Pentecostal church, and even though the pastors were male, I was in Bible quiz. Any Bible quizzes out? Bible quiz was the jam. And so it was Sister Kathy Thornton who was my Bible quiz teacher. And so I'm thinking, okay, this is normal, right? She's one of the youth moms, and she's leading the team, and we're going to places and doing the things. And then when I get to high school, my swim coach asked me to help start the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And so I become the captain for FCA, and my, co-captain or whoever was next to me was also a woman. And so I am used to leading devotional, right, for my high school. But when I got to college, I joined another different church who taught a lot about women in leadership. I saw a lot of women who were women's ministry leaders, married to the evangelist, a very clear distinction. And so my particular discipler was very, very pro-women, like operating in their gifts, but within the context of women. And so it was then taught to me that women's role for leading is among women. And so because I had only ever really wanted to lead women, I was like, sure, great. And so from there, it was that's just how it was, until I got to another church, and there was a female pastor, and she was just like, I don't understand what the problem is. Yeah. And then God began to unshackle some things of what that looked like. And as God began to call me to speak in more mixed audiences, I remember being afraid to be like, no, I wasn't preaching. I was sharing. I was just sharing, my thoughts about Jesus, just casually. And so it would catch me off guard. And when they first asked me to, start contributing on Sundays, I was like, oh, you're not about to have me in sin. That was legit my first thought, because that's what I thought women in leadership was. And I would look at, Joyce Myers like, ma'am, you're going straight to hell. And this is what I thought. And I was like, fool's on you, sister. I guess I'd be going to hell too. And so here we are. But it was just this kind of windy road where I don't know that I didn't think women could or could not be until I was told otherwise. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Sam Cho. I was at Wheaton for a while, and now I'm hoping to go into a program, but we'll see. My first foray into seeing kind of women in leadership was actually college, I would say. Took a bunch of Bible and theology classes here, and at a certain point, as much as you grow up in a super fundamentalist place, I'm from North Carolina, by the way, where the KKK are hiding in the mountains. Actually, they sent out a couple of posters.
But are they hiding?
A little bit. And I think what eventually ended up happening was you kind of have to reckon with the fact that these professors, that many of them are female, are teaching you. And they're teaching you not only the subject at hand, but they're teaching you in such a way that it kind of sticks with you. And you have to reconcile with the fact that, well, if they're not supposed to teach, why do they say it more beautifully? Why is it so much more eloquent? Why, I had great theology, nerds in high school, but I wasn't really introduced to kind of the beauty of the theological language until college. And yes, a couple of them were men, but also they were women. And I think that just eventually, you're just kind of faced with the physical fact, the evidence of no, women can teach. What am I saying? And yeah, Wheaton College, first place where I saw and understood that, I was wrong.
So this project the project we're gathered here for is a visual library, a visual curation of the presence of the stories. Would you reflect with me for a moment, what would the story of Christianity look like for you if it was told also, not from the perspective of women, but as including women? The stories of women were told as the Gospels tell them. For example, many of us evangelicals want to be and ought to be biblically faithful, right? So all sermons on Easter Sunday should be by women. At some point, if you are to be faithful, you have to be faithful. So tell us a little bit about your experience. How are you working in your mind about how to tell stories, or how the story of Christianity, the gospel, that includes women and men, not just men?
I think for me, this was really powerful when I started at Northern last year, January, and Dr. Kovic was my first professor, and I was in awe. It was like Jesus just came down from the clouds and just spoke. And there were so many of my classmates who had the same kind of experience, because we had, for so long, our eyes had just been covered, right, to see what was right in front of us in Scripture that seemed so hidden. And it was it was almost like relearning the gospel, right? After following Jesus for 20 years, it was like, oh, I just need to relearn everything. And then you find yourself like, oh crap, I need to go and apologize. I should probably write a letter to Joyce and be like, sister, I'm so sorry. You don't know me, but I was judging your whole household. But it is this like, it felt like a fuller gospel, right? A more true gospel where you don't have to imagine like creatively, right? Like, well, what would it look like? Maybe, like, I can see it. I don't need an imagination because it's there. And if we would just look at the stories, if we would just see them and give voice to the women that are there, then perhaps our whole understanding of Christianity, perhaps our whole understanding of how men and women relate to each other, perhaps the whole understanding of our roles or not roles, it would just shift, right? Not just Christianity, but our world, right? General human beings and how we connect with each other would just change if we actually saw ourselves. And to, I think her name is Sheena's point, like how do we find people who look like us, right? People of color. And just even, I believe it was Dr. Glan who was giving a presentation when we were in Italy, and I think it was it Peter who was from Africa? Mark. One of those apostles, y'all, was from Africa. And my little mind was like, what? Hold up. And then as we began to look at different artworks and seeing people of color in the art, I was like, oh, so this is what non-whitewashed art looks like. I got it. Because there's so many people in my sphere of influences who are like, anti-Christianity, it's the white man's, da, 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 da. And I'm like, well, some of it, yeah, I get that. But it's refreshing, right? When you begin to see yourself in the text. And you no longer have to like defend people's poor decisions of how they interpreted scripture and now everybody's enslaved and everybody's marginalized. You're like, oh, that's not how it always was, right? It's just giving, bringing the truth into the light.
Thank you.
What was the question?
Write down, bro. What would the story of Christianity look like if we had the perspective of women?
Thank you so much. I guess in many ways I was kind of reminded of how at the end of your kind of essay, Dr. Hughes, you were asking like, who are those who are in the shape of the Christological image? And for me, it's my own mother. My mother was born in 1954, a year after the Korean War ended. And there were 3 really kind of tumultuous republics that happened after that ended. And I think it was until the 80s, North Korea actually was more wealthy than South Korea. And watching kind of like, that means that her parents and my father's parents were, the Japanese are forcibly taking our names away and giving us Japanese names. Where like there wasn't really any even a sense of like human kind of human rights language within, it's better to be Japanese. We are doing you good, And watching my mother, and I think what was kind of pretty amazing for me was after kind of rereading the Gospels after my training in the early church, was watching how much the women were a part of the ministry. How it was so integral that it's not a second thing you do, but actually rather the language of kind of the female experience, varied as it is fundamental to the Christian faith, where I think Methodius of Olympus writes, be like women and be perpetually pregnant and giving birth to new Christians, which I was like, wait a minute, I should be pregnant? And it's just this kind of really beautiful language that, and I think for me, I struggle with particularly the history in the U.S. and the feminization and desexualization of Asian American men, where I'm consistently seeing, this weird dichotomy of like, you're like a woman, and so you're insulting me as a person, but also using this derogatory kind of understanding of femininity. And yet I see in the Christ, no, be like women. Right. And there's this really strange kind of humanity that happens, and also kind of like I'm reckoned with the fact of my own misogyny. How do I see women? How do I see it as a weakness, or is it fundamental to the Christian story? And I think that's where, for me, the training in early church was really beautiful. It kind of helped me re-understand that, I grew up with like kind of the, who's that dude from Mars Hill? I keep forgetting his name. I'm going to keep trying.
He's the dude from Mars Hill, yeah.
I'm going to keep trying. But I grew up with that. Be more manly.
Right.
Be more manly. And in that story, it was be more violent, actually.
Yep.
And it was funny because my mother is left behind. She can't be that. Through her own virtue as a peacemaker, but also through her very own kind of like gender and sexuality. And I was able to reverse that through kind of hearing these incredible women, and also just Methodius of Olympus telling me to be like a woman. And I think that's where it becomes, we always saying be manly. No, be like a woman and love your neighbors. And like whether you kind of go through that by undoing kind of the stereotypes, right? There's kind of, I feel like two ways to, not only ways, but undo the stereotypes from women and let them choose kind of what they wish to be defined within their femininity, or if you're in a more cultural place, like allow men to partake, or be like, as a man, no, I should be like a woman, because that is what Christ is like. So it's like two varied ways of looking at undoing that, and it's just depending on the context for me.
Thank you.
I don't have much to add besides that the Christian story told and remembered without women is just bad history. Yeah.
Thank you. The lengths to which we go to make junior into juniors is an amazing thing. We're going to talk a little bit tomorrow about virtue and what etymology means. But let's continue down that same idea. 80% of the majority of the world, Christianity in the majority of the world, is women. The church is 80% women. So what does the gospel mean in that context? How does Christianity and the gospel, I'm not equating the two, how does Christianity and the gospel interact, engage, give birth in that context?
In the context of there being a predominance of women?
Yeah. If you never see yourself in the story, and yet 80% of the church is women, what do you do with that?
Here's what I'm wrestling in my mind is, how did we get to this place, right? How did we get to the place where 80% of the church is female, right? What did happen to the men, and why is it that we feel like, even though, as many will say that women are the backbone of the church, right? Because things would just fall apart in every sector of the world if women were not holding it down in many ways. But how do we get to this place where not only is there a large imbalance, right? We talk about, my grandma prayed for me. We don't talk about my grandpa prayed for me, right? Like even simple things like that in some of the songs and the hymns that we grew up, it's this indicator that there was always a matriarch that was doing this, but why is that not reflected in leadership? Like, how did we get to a place? And so I don't even know how to I don't even know other than be like, smash the patriarchy. Like, that's my gut response to all things there. But yeah, it's really twisted. Now that you say it, now I feel perplexed.
Should be on a t-shirt somewhere. Either?
I don't know, because you can look at the history, right? You can look at kind of like cultural history, particularly in the U.S. You could look at it kind of wide variety. You can kind of look at it through socioeconomic status, particularly, the availability of education for women. Like, you can look at it in multivalent ways. I think for me, kind of trying to answer the original question of like, what does it mean, that Christianity is kind of this religion that's its population is 80% women. I think for me, it just comes down to kind of just listen to them. And what I mean by that is like, when I'm at church, right, and I'm educated as a master's student, so I have like a high degree of education, and there are multiple kinds of people in my church. From because I go to a multicultural church, I have immigrant moms who can't really speak English. And in many ways, like, my mom still calls me today to make doctor's appointments. Like, I'm 400 miles away from her, and she's still like, Sam, I have a doctor's appointment. Can you call them for me? And I'm like, sure, I can try that. And then inevitably it never goes right. I'm kind of bad at it. I try to be better at it. But from there, you have that to incredibly well-educated women in my church. It's just valent kind of like. And I think for me, particularly because like my father said something to me really interesting to me in a McDonald's once. My family and I were traveling back up to Wheaton, whatever semester it was at, and my mom went to the bathroom, and my dad looked at me, and mind you, he's a first-generation Korean American. He just says, Sam, do you understand like the violence Korean men do to Korean women? And he's talked about, and that just kind of blew me away, that my father, who you would not expect, because here's a sad thing. Misogyny, yes, it's in all cultures, but there's something, for me, I recognize it when I see it in Asian American families. That's just something that I see. And my father recognized it, and he said, your father and I, your grandfather and I, we struggled through this. We were not good to our wives, and we were not good to women. And we had to learn to undo it. And so it was my father telling me to be like, it's your turn. Undo it more. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, it's being really aware. For me, because no matter how much I study, right? Like, no matter how much I study gender studies, I could spend somehow 2,000 years spending. I'm still an outsider to the story. Right. Yes, these are stories of my sisters, my friends, my mothers, but I'm still an outsider. So for me, I think as a male, it's to listen really well, even when, regardless of the education level, regardless of like whether it is attacking me or not, to take the humility and try and understand where that comes from. And I'm pretty bad at it, and I hope to become better at it. And that's how I think I understand myself. If 80% of the church is women, then listen to them, regardless of where they're coming from, because that's the church.
Thank you.
I want to believe that for women, the gospel means freedom. I am still in a point where I'm learning what that means.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to still reconcile, because you were like, Christianity and the gospel not the same. And I was like, okay, what's he talking about, Shala? You say that intentionally, right?
I do.
Right? You say that intentionally. And so the impact that I think that it has, if I think about the church, Christian professing people, or people who profess Christianity being 80% female, and whatever percentage of that church does not allow women to speak and preach the gospel, I think it hinders the advancement of said gospel, right? And so we get to this watered down, right? It's not full, right? It doesn't have the thrust that the gospel is supposed to have, because you don't have the full image bearers representing, the gospel. And if women aren't allowed, or they don't feel like they can see themselves preaching and teaching the gospel to everyone, like the prophetess Anna, everyone who wanted to hear about the coming Messiah was going to listen. If we're not empowered to do that, then the gospel doesn't get preached, right? Because we might be in places where we feel like, well, I'm only allowed to share the gospel with other women, right? I'm not allowed, unless they're my son, unless I birth them, and I'm allowed to share the gospel with them until they're 13 or, I don't know, 18, whatever the imaginary law is. I'm not allowed to, therefore, share the gospel with my coworker, with my neighbor, or not in a way to like sit down and study the Bible with you, because then I would be crossing boundaries. Right. And then if there's this just mass exodus for whatever reason, right? If people think that the gospel is, too feminine and I need to be more manly, now you have, taken men out of the gospel, and why would they want that, right? If they're told that that's not what they should be.
That's right.
Right, and then we just get jacked up. That's my theological response. We get jacked up.
Thank you. Yeah,
The technical term, yes.
Technical term. I have one more question for all three of you, and then we have about 15 minutes to open discussions or questions from the audience. Why are you involved in this project? Why do you want to be involved in this project? Why would you be involved in this project? Give me something. Because you and I are going to travel the world for a year.
Because we're going to travel the world. I was just asking Jesus, how can I travel for the rest of the year?
Yeah, that's right.
And I just felt like the Lord just descended and was like, yes, I have a solution for you right here. So I got introduced to the project because I got to go to Italy with Dr. Cohick and Dr. Glahn. And then through a rabbit trail, they discovered that I'm a photographer. So I got to play an active part in building, this library. And so it becomes very interesting to see what this looks like. And even in our first hunt for Crispina, right, there was like this exhilaration of like, we found her. She is here. There is evidence. Take the picture. And I was just like, yes, I have achieved something great today. This is amazing. And so to elaborate on that, it becomes like once we got to all of the art where women were stripped of their authority, I was kind of like, wow, I don't want to look at this. Where's the more Crispinas? I want to see all the evidences. I don't want the, male washed artwork. But I think it just becomes important because I want other people to have the same, like, it's right there in your face. Right? This isn't a modern phenomenon, but this was always a part of the gospel story, right? And they're in there. We just reserve their stories for Mother's Day and Easter, maybe if you're lucky, and Christmas, maybe if you're lucky.
Every time I'm at church, it's a little awkward because people genuinely want to know about the history of the church. It's kind of weird because, like you said, Dr. Kalantzis, I've been in this world, not as long as you, but I've been in this world for 8 years now after, early church studies at Wheaton. And I forget how awe-striking it was for me, how when I read Augustine for the first time, he just sounded like no other theologian that I've met in the modern world. Even though everyone is somewhat Augustinian in the Western world, I was still blown away by how different he sounded. And I think for me, one of the things that I struggle with is when people are like, where can I get these sources, particularly these sources on women? I just don't have a good way to point them out. It's really difficult finding the most recent critical or English edition of these texts. I have to okay, wait a minute. So this started here and this goes there. And if this takes me a day to look for, there's no way I think lay people in the church are going to be able to find it. It's just way too hard, and you cannot make that inaccessible to the church. And so part of a project like this that I find just fascinating is a website is a link, and you can just be check this out, bro. Check it out, bro. You can totally look it up. Sorry, this is what I would sound like to my friends my age.
So my first response as to why I am interested in this project is because, well, you were my boss. So I have to be interested, or you are at least the one who introduced me to this project, and it's how I found out about it.
I like the first one.
Yeah. But if I might tell a story that will explain why I am now interested in the project and its purpose. So in that Women in History and Theology class, Dr. Kalantzis, I believe it was at the beginning of the semester, you asked the students, which there's two of my fellow classmates in the audience here. Thank you for coming. This means a lot. But you asked us about the mosaic on the first floor of the Billy Graham Hall. Now, I practically live in this building, as most of us do. I walk by this mosaic multiple times per day. And you asked us the very simple question of what's on the mosaic? What is the mosaic of? And none of us had a response, which was quite embarrassing, considering that we walk by this mosaic every single day. And it wasn't until you, Dr. Kalantzis, pointed out that it was the story of the woman at the well being told. That was the first sight that you see as you enter the Billy Graham Hall, where all the theological and biblical studies classes take place. And this is the narrative which we enter into every time we step foot in that building. But it required for you pointing out what that story was before I was able to stop for just a moment and see it for the first time. And now, every time that I step foot within that building, I cannot unsee the story being told. And the website, the collection, is doing just that, and that it is giving a guide for those who may not be familiar with these images. It is giving them a guide and helping them to see for what for many will be for the very first time.
Thank you. And if you are wondering what Michelle is talking about, the Billy Graham Hall is the big ugly building that side. No, you cannot miss it on the other side of the street. Enter. The mosaic she's talking about is bigger than this wall. And most people just ignore it. They literally do not see it. You're 15 feet from it when you enter. And you just simply don't see it.
That's a commentary on all women's lives.
We can take a tour if you want. The what?
You just don't. That's a commentary on all women's lives.
Yeah,
just don't see her.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So we have about 10 minutes for your questions, if you have questions for our participants. Now, on average, faculty, you know how long we wait when we give an question? 7 seconds. So this is it. It is a real thing, yeah. At 4, I appoint somebody and say, what do you have to say? Dr. Kohik, any questions you have to ask of the panel?
I'll wait for others.
Okay, I see.
I say, no, as a mom of young kids, I can wait you out.
Yeah.
I don't have young kids anymore, but still.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sheena Ashcroft. I'm from DTS. I just wanted to say to Sam, I wrote down something you said. You said, no, be more like a woman. It's fundamental to the Christian story. And that was really moving to me because I was sitting here just wondering how much more like a man I need to be to participate in Christian scholarship. And yeah, I just thank you for that.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Hester. I'm a recent DTS grad, and I just kind of wanted to make a comment. I was very much intrigued by your question, why is the church 80% women? And I had read a recent study about the spirituality of women, and I think it was a U.S. context, but that in comparison with men, it was a pretty extensive study, that they just do all the spiritual disciplines so much more than men do. And so I just wonder if that doesn't play into this whole why is there 80%, Also, I think it would be interesting to hear what y'all think about how God uses the oppression of women actually to grow the church.
I have this parallel thought to what you're saying in terms of women doing the spiritual disciplines more, right? It might be a more natural part of our lives, and it made me wonder if men don't see it as much in their worlds, does it make them think that they're not good enough to be more active participants in the gospel? And so they bow out, right? And they don't participate. I also realize that in different, cultures and circumstances, even if you go back to the early church, I'm always being told, like, women were widowed young, right? The men were dying. And so I wonder if there's a issue there, of what is happening to our men, whether they go off to war and, all those kinds of things that impact the length of life of men in particular. But I do wonder, like, because you don't see it enough, do you just bow out, whereas we might see it more as women? And so we engage and we stay.
Yeah. Actually, the death rate of women in Roman antiquity was 2 times as high as men.
Because they are giving birth.
They're giving birth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question. All of you can answer. It'd be interesting to hear all, but you don't have to. I hear a lot of language just about sort of journey and feeling like, you're not quite there yet, or these things. What do you feel like you still need? Where do you feel kind of vulnerable and need a mentorship? Where do you feel like you have a lack of experience or support? So any of that sort of thing. What do you still need?
So my first thought was $1 million. That's what I need. Sister, you are paying attention. Yes. How would I spend it? I would just be traveling. I would call you and be like, Dr. Glon, where are we going? What do we need to do? I'm here. Yes, I'm here for it. Okay. I volunteer as tribute. Okay, what do I need other than $1 million? I think not just but I think women in particular need more programs like what I am experiencing at Northern, right? So whenever I talk about it, people are like, wow, like that's a thing, like where is that? Because in my hunt for a seminary, this was the only place that I even found something like it. And when I found it, it set my whole body on fire because I was like, this is what I am supposed to be studying. This is what I need because I'm on this journey to activate women in ministry because I want to see more women preaching the gospel and feeling free to. But I think that if there aren't more avenues where women are intentionally being chased after and said, yes, you. Yes, you. You can preach the gospel. You can do this. You were not disqualified by your age, your demographics, your marital status, any of those things. Whatever God has put in you, you go preach it. And so I just think that there aren't enough of those kinds of programs that are accessible to all people, even women who, one of my friends was like, how do I get into seminary? And I assumed that she had already went to college. I was like, oh, I don't know what the answer is then. Like, I was like, I feel like there's like a BA, MA program at Northern, but like, how do we just make that more accessible? I feel like that would be
I have a slightly different reaction to that question, and thank you for asking it. For me, in my present state, I need to know with confidence that God's love for me is unfailing. And that is something that takes time. And it also requires the love from the community around me as well. So.
I'm not sure. I think possibly some of the uncertainty comes from because I guess I need to brag about Dr. Kowick. I just feel like Dr. Kowick has been this kind of incredible mentor for me. Her and I would also say like Dr. Jennifer McNutt from Wheaton College are the two women that I just am like, I just wouldn't be who I am and how I think about myself spiritually, academically. And yeah, so I don't know. For me personally, I have what I want, which is the community that cares about me. But going back to what you said, one of the things I kind of thought about, one of my dreams is, right, when I'm like, I mean, yes. But one of my dreams, absolute dreams, is when I'm like 80 years old, which I think Kalantzis is like, you're going to still teach when you're 80? I mean, I don't know. I would love to have particularly a program for students of color to study ancient languages over the summer. And the reason for that is, you know, I don't know, I'm not going to blame any system for this, not just because I just haven't done the research on it. I just felt that the early church was inaccessible to me. And it blew me away when I found out Augustine was from Northern Africa. My favorite, kind of Platonist thinkers are from Alexandria in Egypt. And my favorite Holy Family is from modern-day Turkey. And in just realizing that it's not even remotely in modern-day Europe, it's the surrounding area. And for me, it blew me away, and it gave me space to think about my own racial identity. When I realized that Augustine, yeah, he's kind of a jerk at times, not as big as Tertullian, but like he gave me space in his Confessions to consider the things that I deeply wanted as a Korean American. And I just want, for me personally, I want like other students of color to realize this kind of beautiful richness of the early church that provides them the space.
Thank you.
That's good.
Just very quickly, my name is Mike Canaris. I'm a theologian at Loyola University Chicago. And so coming from a Catholic background, particularly a Catholic Jesuit background, it's so interesting to me, this sort of conversation, the reference points, things where they intersect and things where at some level we're speaking a different language in many ways, right? And so a lot of this is interpretive, and I see that as part of the project, the goal here, this sort of hermeneutical analysis, the translation, the interpretation of these images. And one that comes to mind in particular, much of 20th and 21st century Catholic theology revolves around this see, judge, act methodology that's really part of liberation theology in the Latin American context. And so it was hugely influential, the Second Vatican Council and elsewhere. And so the first step in this kind of transformative methodology is seeing. Right? How do you analyze the situation around you so then you can judge and act accordingly, right? Discern and get engaged somehow. And so I see the work that you're engaged in here and that your professors are engaged in as a step into seeing this work differently with new eyes. And so I want to just commend you on the work you're doing in sort of being a key component in that translation, in that kind of dialogue and exchange that is moving across not only sort of eons and cultures or eras and cultures, but also across denominational divides. And so I think I think it's a really important project that you're engaged in, and I hope to support it in any way I can from our end. A lot of our work, I'm in the Institute of Pastoral Studies, we're 75% women, about 2/3 Catholic. But always rooted in this idea of a faith that does justice. That's the big Jesuit language. And so I think that there's so many overlaps between what you're talking about and what you're not. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. And on that, let us thank our students.